Now, carbon dioxide is also considered a greenhouse gas. So we want to look at the carbon cycle. Plants play a key role by absorbing carbon dioxide from the air during photosynthesis, and then they use that carbon as they grow, right? They're converting it into carbohydrates and they're converting it into parts of their body. Then animals consume the plants and they pass the carbon basically through the food chain. So as each animal eats another animal, or more animals eats plants, it's all being passed through the food chain. And it can be, some of that carbon can be released back into the atmosphere through the process of respiration, cellular respiration. So we talked about that process early on in the semester, right, where organisms are breaking down their food molecules to convert them to ATP. And because of that, the breaking of the bonds releases the carbon in the form of carbon dioxide. Now, when organisms die, their carbon can be returned to the soil or locked away for millions of years in fossil fuels. So, when you think about it, fossil fuels are organisms that have died a long time ago, and that carbon has been taken out of the cycle for millions of years. So oceans are also a large amount, store a large amount of carbon. They store it in their water and also in the organisms that are living in the ocean are carbon based. So human activities like burning fossil fuels. So that would be the combustion there, is the burning of fuels will release carbon. Even deforestation, the cutting down of trees, right? And the burning of their wood releases carbon back into the atmosphere. So this upsets the cycle because this carbon has been out of circulation for millions of years, and now we're releasing a huge amount of carbon back into the cycle. So even though it was once part of the cycle, it's been out of the cycle for such a long period of time that it's very disruptive to release it all back at one time. And of course, we also have the process of decomposition, and so that's also releasing carbon. And it's just helping to complete that cycle, though. So decomposition is more the breaking down of the bodies of dead animals and plants, and those were things that were just more recently living. So this image from your book is showing the carbon cycle. It's including kind of manufacturing and transportation and drilling. So kind of the human side, the human aspect of how we're producing a lot of carbon dioxide, and all of that's going back up into the atmosphere. So you see a lot of the arrows are going all up into the atmosphere. We see a few that are taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and that's photosynthesis, with plants taking up the carbon dioxide. Um, and we see some of the animals then eating the plants, but then we get a little bit of cellular respiration giving the carbon dioxide back off. And so this is happening both in the terrestrial environment and also in the aquatic environment with the marine animals they're showing there. All right, now we want to move on to the phosphorus cycle. So the phosphorus cycle is a unique cycle because it does not involve the atmosphere, all right? But you may be asking, why are we talking about phosphorus? The other two, you have kind of, there's a direct relationship between the organisms, between carbon and water, but why phosphorus, right? So phosphorus, if you remember, is essential for DNA, right? We know that nucleotides consist of a sugar, phosphate, and a nitrogenous base, so that's a phosphate group. We know that ATP has phosphate groups, and that cell membranes are made up of phospholipids, so phosphorus is essential, one of our essential elements for life. So in order for plants to grow, phosphorus is one of the nutrients that is added in fertilizers. Okay, so it's an important cycle to also look at. So, as we said, it's unique because it doesn't involve the atmosphere at all. The cycle begins when phosphate is released from the weathering of rocks. So, when rocks slowly break down through the weathering process, they're releasing phosphorus into the soil and into the water. And then plants are able to absorb these phosphates through the roots, and then animals obtain phosphorus by eating plants or other animals. And then when the organisms produce waste or they die, decomposers then return the phosphorus to the soil. And then over long periods, some phosphorus is carried to the oceans where it can become part of the marine sediments and eventually form new rocks. All right, so you see this happening in the image here, where it's showing kind of the mountain where you've got weathering occurring, or right. So any of the rain and the freezing and thawing cycles of rock will release phosphorus. Okay. And then that runs downstream into the rivers and then becomes part of the marine environment where marine plants take it up and they're eaten by marine animals. And then decomposition happens and then it goes back down into the sediment. They're also showing in this image fertilizer runoff since phosphorus is used in fertilizers, and then that can also go into our aquatic systems. Okay. So the fertilizer helps the plants to grow, and then the plants are eaten by the animals. So moving the phosphorus through the food chain, and then it's showing the waste from the animals being decomposed in the soil, and once again, kind of running down into our waterways. All right, and the last cycle that we're going to talk about is the nitrogen cycle. So the nitrogen cycle can get very complicated. So we have so if we look at the top left corner, it's talking about lightning. And so our nitrogen cycle really starts in the air because our atmosphere is about 78% nitrogen. Great component, right? It's the majority of the elements in our air is nitrogen. So this nitrogen needs to make its way from the atmosphere down into the ground or into the organism so that it can be utilized. And it's showing lightning there because lightning can actually help to convert nitrogen. All right. So when it lightnings and it rains, it's almost like it's raining down fertilizer in a sense. And I don't know if you've ever noticed, like you can water your plants all day long with water from your house, but after a good rain, the plants seem to grow a lot better. And that's simply because of the nitrogen that's coming down in the rain when there's lightning also happening. So there's a little bit of a process there that helps to convert the nitrogen. So there's kind of nitrogen fixation that happens there. We've also talked about microorganisms that can fix nitrogen. So we see some on the right-hand side with the plant roots. So some organisms actually have nitrogen fixing bacteria that they keep in their root system. So some beans and other plants will have little kind of fertilizer factories in a sense growing amongst their roots. And we also talked about some of the cyanobacteria in lab being able to fix nitrogen in their heterocysts. So these are organisms that are converting nitrogen into a form that plants can use. And usually it's some type of nitrate, which is that NO3 that you see there. So you see a lot of arrows kind of converging from NH4 or NH3 to NO2 to NO3 don't worry about all these chemical formulas here. So it's just going from ammonium or ammonia to ammonium to nitrite to nitrate. They're just different forms of nitrogen. So all this is happening usually with bacteria or with different microorganisms that are in the soil helping to do these different conversions. All right, and our decomposers as well. But once nitrogen gets taken up by the plants, it gets incorporated into their tissues, right? Because nitrogen is essential for the production of amino acids, and those are needed for proteins. So the plants incorporate it into their tissues, and then the plants are eaten by animals, and they use those amino acids to make new proteins for themselves. And then once they die, decomposers release that nitrogen back into the soil. There's also the process of denitrification, where we have nitrate going back into nitrogen gas. So it does kind of go full circle, where we have microorganisms that are fixing nitrogen into a form that can be used by organisms on land. And then there's other microorganisms, excuse me, that will, excuse me, that will convert the nitrogen, the nitrate back into nitrogen gas and back up into the atmosphere again. So once again, don't get too concerned about all the nitrification reactions there. Just know that the organisms are converting it into forms that plants can readily use. And then the plants feed the animals, and then the animals die, and the decomposers release the nitrogen back into the soil, gets converted back into plants, or into the nitrogen that the plants can use, or it gets released back up into the atmosphere. So we have covered many of the abiotic factors that are present in ecosystems, and we've kind of highlighted and seen how the nutrients move through these ecosystems. So we've paid particular attention to carbon and the hydrologic cycle, as it's very important to understanding climate change and how human activities have really had an effect or really disrupted these natural processes.